Welcome, everybody. We'll just give people a moment to come in through the cyberspace door. Still people joining us, so we'll just give it a minute. Hi, everybody. Welcome. Right, well, thank you for joining us for today's Women's Sport Trust webinar. I'm Tammy Parler, Chief Exec of the Women's Sport Trust, and I'll be your host for the next 60 minutes. For a number of years now, WST has been on a mission to increase the data available to the industry by providing consistent reporting on women's sport. This has accelerated insight, influenced strategies, provided evidence for pitches, and offered an essential benchmark and stimulus for growth. Women's sport is in a massive growth phase, and the data and insight that will take us to the next phase will continue to get more sophisticated. This morning, we'll share with you two important parts of the puzzle. Future Sport and Entertainment will talk us through the latest visibility numbers, and then we'll follow that with some new research conducted for us by Gemba. It's an extension of visibility and looks into where audiences feel underserved, the types of content they want, and how much they're willing to pay for it. This second presentation is part of a partnership between the Women's Sport Trust and the R&A ahead of this year's AIG Women's Open in August. This is first of its kind insight, and we're very grateful to the R&A for them allowing us to share some of those findings more widely and with the industry, and obviously with you this morning. Following both presentations, there'll be a chance to ask questions, so please list them in the chat, and you can also download the full report from the Women's Sport Trust website. We'd also be grateful if you can share any of our posts on social media and tagging us, obviously, tagging the Women's Sport Trust accounts. Lastly, please note that we have another webinar very soon on the 6th of July, where we'll continue to unpick viability as we share another project looking at the opportunities there are to invest in women's sport right now. I'll post a link to that in the chat shortly. So here to present your visibility findings this morning are Emma Gibson and Shalina Nigam from Future Sport and Entertainment, who provide broadcast analysis to our report. Over to you guys.
Thanks, Tammy. So to start, before we get into any of the numbers, we're just going to go through a quick definition slide. So any time we reference women's sport, that kind of refers to properties where we can easily split out. So things like England cricket or the Barclays Women's Super League, TikTok Six Nations, that kind of thing. And then the equivalent for men's. And then mixed is where we can't split that out so easily. So things like tennis tournaments and big global tournaments. So to start, we wanted to look at the first 5 years of the month. So as you can see, 2023 was the highest, reaching 22 million viewers. So obviously a really exciting start to the year and surpassing the previous high that we saw in 2021. We'll obviously get into a bit more detail about what drove that record number, but that was mostly driven by record tournaments in the ICC Women's T20 World Cup, TikTok Six Nations, and the Barclays Women's Super League. So in addition to reaching the most viewers ever in the first 5 months, what's really encouraging to see is that women's sport viewers are actually becoming increasingly more engaged. So this chart here is showing how many, what percentage of people have watched on more than one occasion. So here, 57% of people that watched women's sport so far this year have watched on more than one occasion. As you can see, there's kind of a clear increase in 2023 across all of those thresholds. But it's particularly pleasing when you look a bit further down. So kind of 4, 5 occasions and more, you can see there's a real difference between this year and last year and then the previous years. So it's positive to see that that engagement is really continuing. And then focusing a bit on just the last 2 years, we wanted to look at coverage hours. So what channels are actually showing women's sport so far this year. And as you can see, Sky Sports very much dominates that. So accounting for the top 6 channels out of top 8. Obviously, Sky Sports put a lot of effort and marketing around their women's sport coverage. So it's pleasing to see that that's really paying off. And I guess the main bit to highlight here is that Sky Sports Cricket channel being number 1. So obviously with the ICC Women's T20 World Cup earlier this year, Sky Sports Cricket was highest in terms of coverage hours and up 29% on last year's number. And then looking also at coverage hours, but then converting that to viewing hours. So the coverage hours has remained relatively stable this year versus last year on key channels. So kind of hovering at that 13% there to 15%. But when you look on the right-hand side to viewing hours, you can see that there's quite a drop. So it was 11% in 2022 and just 5% for 2023. However, that percentage has dropped given the lack of mixed global tournaments. So if you think back to this time last year, we had the Winter Olympics and the Winter Paralympics. Obviously, this year we haven't had those mixed global tournaments. So that percentage is lower there. But again, kind of harping back to the ICC Women's T20 World Cup, you can see that the highest proportion in both coverage hours and viewing hours was for Sky Sports Cricket. So next, we're going to take a look at women's football on both the domestic and international side. So firstly, to start with the Barclays Women's Super League, we just looked across a few key metrics, and it's really pleasing to see that across all of those, this season outperformed the previous one. So 16.5 million people were reached across the whole season, which is an increase of 1.4 million on last season for live games. However, what's interesting to see is kind of the more engaging metrics. So things like average audience per game, and average minutes viewed per game, and average minutes viewed in total. All of those increased. So again, kind of similar to the overall women's sport viewership. It's showing that it's not just reaching more people and attracting that audience, but it's actually attracting a much more engaged audience as well. And then obviously the Barclays Women's Super League airs across BBC and Sky Sports. So we wanted to break that down a bit more and see how the differences look for those channels. So obviously you can see some red decreases there for BBC Two, but that's primarily due to the fact that 3 fewer games aired on that channel this season than last season. Again, when you look at the more kind of engaged metric of live game average audience, you can see that BBC Two has actually had a double-digit increase. So again, fewer games, but a more engaged audience again, which is really positive. And then again, looking at the right-hand side, the Sky Showcase, which, as you might know, is available to Sky viewers, but you don't have to have a Sky Sports package, so kind of brings in a bit of a different audience there. There were 6 more games than were cast on that channel this season versus last, which again boosted those metrics. Another way that I guess we can measure success is looking at the time slot average. So looking at the same day, time, channel, and kind of taking an average and seeing how does that compare to windows of the Barclays WSL. So on the left-hand side, we've obviously got it for BBC One. And as you can see there, that across those afternoon slots on a weekend, the Barclays WSL audiences are kind of relatively stable. But then when you look at the time slot average on BBC One, that audience is much higher, almost kind of double what a live game is getting. But then when you look on the right-hand side to BBC Two, it's quite a positive story. So I guess firstly, there's one weekday evening slot there. As you can see, that generally in a prime time is going to get a higher audience. So you can see that both the Barclays WSL and the time slot average is a bit higher there. But what's positive to see is those afternoon slots are kind of gaining the same audience that BBC Two would get kind of in other programming. So that's really positive to see that Barclays WSL is kind of maintaining that same audience that BBC Two would get. And then looking at the same concept here, but just looking at a key target in under 35s. And again, a positive story here. So on the left-hand side, we've got BBC One and the right-hand side, BBC Two, but kind of across both of those, the average for the Barclays WSL games and the time slot is kind of relatively stable, and if not higher for BBC Two. So really positive there that the league is bringing in a different audience to those free-to-air channels that wouldn't normally watch. And then taking that one step further in terms of demographics, there are kind of more encouraging stories. So as I mentioned, obviously, this season has already surpassed last season and is kind of outperforming the broadcaster average as well, which is really positive. But obviously another way that we can measure success and kind of benchmark is against the men's sport equivalent. So here for the BBC, we've compared it to Match of the Day and Match of the Day 2, and then live Premier League games for Sky. And again, a positive story in that the Barclays WSL this season bringing in a younger and more female audience than some of those men's equivalents. So again, kind of to the side of women's sport having their own specific audience, and kind of how does that compare and contrast to some of the other sports that are on TV. And then switching away slightly, but sticking with domestic women's football, to the Vitality Women's FA Cup. So the final that aired last month was actually unfortunately the lowest audience that we'd seen since 2016, aired on BBC One, still gained over 1 million viewers, but obviously lower than some of those peaks that we saw pre-COVID. This year's game conflicted with both Arsenal and Man City playing the Premier League, and obviously with the title run-in that had quite high interest. However, it wasn't, I guess, all a negative story, in that when we broke it down a bit more, and I guess kind of trying to stick on that theme of engagement, looked at the female proportion. So as you can see, second highest female proportion of the audience there, just under 42%. But what's most encouraging is that average minutes viewed time per female. So it was the highest this year, so kind of watching for the longest period on average. So just over 60 minutes, and that was obviously the highest we'd seen in this period. So while the overall audience was a bit lower, it's encouraging to see that females were tuning in for the longest period across this time frame. And then I guess obviously wanting to take a note at streaming as well, because it plays a big part of these metrics in painting the full story. And I guess, again, it was kind of similar stories across that. So this here looking at watch time across women's football on YouTube by quarter. And again, as you can see, obviously Q4 for last year was significantly the highest across this period, kind of double some of those other quarters. And there's been a clear interest, I guess, since 2022. You can see that those numbers kind of bit higher, hovering above 300 minutes. So to see that there's kind of a clear trend of increasing there. And then obviously the Women's Super League, the Women's Champions League is a big part of YouTube coverage. So DAZN has their own dedicated YouTube channel, and there were 50 million views for that content across the last season, which again, kind of in keeping with record numbers everywhere else, was up 17% on the previous season. And then again, positively looking at different demographics, female viewership was up, as well as young viewers, so 13 to 34. And I guess another kind of interesting aspect to women's sport viewers being potentially a bit different is that there was an increase across all devices as well, in particular mobile viewership, so up 53%. And then finally, before looking ahead to international football, we wanted to quickly look at the impact of the Women's Euros last summer on women's sport. So the left-hand side here is showing people that had watched women's sport in 2023 by property, split by those that did watch the Euros summer and then those that didn't. And so, as you might expect, those that had watched the Women's Euros last year kind of most interested in football, either domestic or games featuring the Lionesses, while those that hadn't watched the Euros are more interested in cricket and golf so far. And then on the right-hand side, kind of that same looking at engagement and threshold levels of people that have watched more than once. You can see that those that did watch the Euros were slightly more engaged with women's sport this year. So 64% of those that had watched Women's Euros last year and watched women's sport this year had watched on more than one occasion, compared to 51% who didn't watch the Women's Euros. So obviously still quite a high proportion, and people are clearly engaged in women's sport and coming back to watch. But yeah, I guess it's encouraging to see that those that watched Women's Euros have come back to watch women's sport, but even those that didn't are finding new ways and new gateway sports into women's sport.
Finally, on football, we just want to take up some international women's football matches that's taken place both back end of last year and also early this year. Now, this chart here just shows the top 10 most watched international women's football matches on record outside of global tournaments. So global tournaments being the likes of the FIFA Women's World Cup or the UEFA Women's Euros. And you can see that the top four in this chart all come from games that have taken place following the very historic Lionesses win last summer. So clearly an impact there, a boost in interest that people are wanting to go away and watch more Lionesses games outside of that tournament football. Now that switch also coincided with a move from games airing on BBC Two previously, with the switch to ITV1 following that Euros win. So there's definitely a double impact there, both the boost from the Euros win, but also that switch in broadcaster and the high audiences that ITV1 is able to garner for these particular Lionesses games. Finally, on football, we just wanted to take a look ahead to the upcoming Women's World Cup 2023. And in doing so, we've here looked at the average live audience for England games in the previous two tournaments, so 2015 and 2019. And what we found was that the England average audience for games in 2019 was almost double that of what we saw for 2015. So clearly a boost in interest in audiences there from one tournament to the next. Although a crucial point to note here is that a host nation impact. So 2015 was held in Canada versus 2019 held in France, which is of course a much more social time zone for viewers in the UK to be watching games. And that's an important point to note, because I'm sure all of you know that this summer's Women's World Cup is to be co-hosted in Australia and New Zealand. So of course, games are going to be happening at slightly less social time, start times to what we saw for 2019 in France. Having said that, England's opening group game, for example, against Haiti, will have a start time of 10:30 on a Saturday morning in the UK. And we learned from the Women's Rugby World Cup last year that that particular time slot and those kind of mid-morning to early morning can still garner quite impressive audiences given the time that it's starting at. So we're really looking forward to seeing what happens with the Women's World Cup this summer and the audiences that it's able to bring in. Moving on now to a Women's Rugby Union update, and specifically the TikTok Women's Six Nations. This chart just lays out some of the key audience metrics for the 2023 tournament versus previous years, so going all the way back to 2017. And the key thing to note here, the most important story here, is that the 2023 edition was the most viewed TikTok Women's Six Nations that we've ever seen on record. So 10.4 million viewing hours across live and non-live content for this year's tournament. And what's really, really positive there as well is that if you look on the left-hand side at coverage hours, actually the coverage hours in 2022 and 2023 were pretty consistent with also the same broadcaster in BBC. So to be able to boost the viewing hours at the rate that it did year on year off the back of the same amount of coverage hours is a really, really positive story. And on the reach side of things, 6.1 million people watched 3 minutes or more of the tournament this year, and that's an increase of 0.4 million more people being brought in to watch the tournament than what we saw last year. So really across the board, some really, really positive numbers there for the property. And another way we wanted to really highlight the strong performance that the Women's Six Nations saw this year in terms of its audiences is benchmarking the time slots that the Women's Six Nations matches received versus the typical time slot average. And by time slot average, we mean what does that particular channel and that particular day and that particular time typically receive in terms of audience, and how does that compare to what we saw for the Women's Six Nations? But we also looked at it for a few other women's sport properties on free-to-air so far this year, so some international women's football and also domestic football, as you can see in the chart, and also the Vitality Netball International Series between England and Jamaica earlier this year. And what we found was that actually it was the Women's Six Nations that outperformed the typical time slot average to a greater extent than all those other women's sport broadcasts that we looked at. So that peak for that top row coming for the final game, the very crucial England v France game in the Six Nations, where the average audience was 103% higher than what BBC Two typically receives on that day and on that time. So it's really highlighting that this particular property has been able to bring in more viewers to that channel, BBC Two, on the day and the time that it's taking place. Sticking with the Women's Six Nations, we also had a look at the demographic breakdown year on year. So how did the 2023 tournament compare to who was watching the 2022 tournament? And the key story to note here was that we saw quite a notable increase in the proportion of female viewers for this year's property versus last year. So 37% of the overall audience in 2022 were female, going up to 42% for this year's tournament. So quite a clear increase there. And secondly, the under 17 age group also saw a sizable increase, so going from 2% in 2022, doubling to 4% in 2023. So two key quite audience groups there that we're seeing increases in their share of the overall audience. So not only overall growth, but also growth in some of the kind of key target audiences for women's sport. Jumping back to that notion of time slot average now. Now I highlighted that overall, the Women's Six Nations did a good job of outperforming the time slot average on BBC Two. But we also wanted to dig a bit deeper into that to see what the demographic breakdown of those people that are watching the Women's Six Nations and how they compare to that BBC Two time slot average. And what we found was that firstly, the Women's Six Nations audience skew a bit more male than what we see for a typical time slot average on BBC Two for that particular day and time. However, the Women's Six Nations does in fact over-index on under 35 viewing, so younger viewers coming in, and also children and household viewers. So that demo is almost a proxy for kind of family-orientated individuals. So two quite key demographics there in young people and families, that we're seeing the Women's Six Nations is actually able to bring into the BBC Two to a greater extent to what we usually see on that particular channel. And sticking with demographics, we also wanted to have a look at the regional breakdown of the 2023 Women's Six Nations. Now with this, there's three distinct audience groups that we've laid out here. The first one being people that only watch the Women's Six Nations, i.e. didn't watch any of the Men's Six Nations this year. The middle one being people that watch both, i.e. people that watch at least 3 minutes of some of the Women's Six Nations and the Men's, and on the right-hand side, people that just watch the Men's Six Nations, i.e. didn't watch any of the Women's. And what we found was there was quite a bit of variation between the regional makeup of these three distinct groups. And the one we've just called out here is audiences from Wales. And you can see that 13% of people that just watch the Women's Six Nations came from this particular region, or country rather, in Wales's case. And that was quite a big increase, or a big difference to what we saw for people just watching the Men's Six Nations at 5%. And also, crucially, it was quite a high year-on-year interest. So back in 2021, that figure was 4%. up to 6% in 2022, and now going all the way up to 13% this year is quite a sizable increase. And one of the reasons for that was that the BBC aired the highest amount of Wales games on linear TV this year that it ever has. So clearly, this shows that there's a real appetite for, or there's a real home nation interest there. And if the games are airing on linear TV, then people in that country in Wales are clearly going to watch it and get engaged and make up more of the overall audience than actually what we see for the men's Six Nations. So quite an interesting story there in terms of that regional makeup. And finally, on the Six Nations, sticking with that notion of those three distinct groups, so people that just watch women's, people that watch both, and people that just watch men's, what we found was that of the 17.7 million people that watch 3 minutes or more of the men's Six Nations, just 4.4 million of them also watched the women's Six Nations. So what that means is that there's still 80% of that 17.7 million that only watched the men's and didn't watch any of the women's. So that's quite a sizable group of clearly rugby union fans that are watching the women's Six Nations that perhaps haven't yet been exposed or have been transferred over to be women's rugby union fans. Sorry. So clearly a real opportunity to transfer them over to grow the kind of women's rugby union side of things. And we dug a bit deeper into those two groups, so people that just watched the women's and just watched the men's, and had a look at the demographic breakdown further of those beyond just the region. And interesting, what we found was that it's the men's Six Nations viewers, or just watching that tournament, that skewed more female and younger than what we actually saw for those just watching the women's Six Nations. So not only is there a really big group of people here that could be transferred over to women's rugby union fans from the men's side of the game, but also this particular group skew favourably to some of the key target audiences for women's sport, like females and younger viewers. Moving on now to a women's cricket update, and specifically looking at the ICC Women's T20 World Cup that took place in South Africa earlier this year. This slide here just lays out the total UK live viewing hours for all ICC Women's T20 World Cup tournaments by year. And the most important thing to note on this slide is that you can see at 7.1 million live UK viewing hours, the 2023 tournament was the most watched we've ever seen for this particular tournament. And the other thing we wanted to call out here was that from 2018 onwards was when the tournament became standalone. And by standalone, what we mean is that the women's edition got its own separate host country and date to the men's. So before that, it was bundled in and taking place at the same time and in the same location as the men's. But actually from 2018 onwards, i.e. the past three tournaments, it's been its own separate tournament. And you can see the impact that's had on viewership, because what it's meant is that all 23 games from then on have been broadcast on Sky. And you can see kind of 2018, 2020, 2023, there's a clear increase in that overall tournament viewership as a result of that unbundling. We also, sticking with this tournament, we also had a look at the average live audience by tournament for matches involving England and also not involving England. And the two green and grey far right bars highlight the 2023 numbers for this. And you can see that the 150k and the 62k are the highest average live audiences since that unbundling from 2018 onwards that we've seen, which is really positive in itself. That yes, that there's growth in the England audiences, so people clearly tuning in to watching them, but not only that, there's growth in the non-England matches. So it's not just a home nation interest driving this, but actually there's an overall clear increase in interest around this tournament and women's cricket more broadly. We also had a look at combining the 2023 edition with the most comparable or the most recent men's ICC T20 World Cup. So for 2023, that one is the 2022 Men's World Cup that took place at the back end of last year, which of course England went on to famously win. So we combined the viewership for both those two tournaments. I did so for the previous three editions of both the men's and the women's T20 World Cups. And what we found was that the share for the most recent one was highest for the women's tournament viewing than what we've ever seen. So 15% of that total was for the women's tournament viewing, and that's far higher or slightly higher than what we've seen previously. So really highlighting that the women's edition is clearly making up more and more of the share of that total, and seeing growth to a greater extent than actually what we're seeing for the men's, for that proportion to be increasing. And finally, on cricket, we just wanted to look ahead to the Women's Ashes that starts this Thursday with the test at Trent Bridge. And in doing so, we had a look at the previous two Women's Ashes series, so 2015 and 2019. And what we found was that when we looked into the total viewership numbers, 2015 viewership was notably quite higher than what we saw in 2019, which kind of goes against the trend of kind of ongoing year-by-year increases for women's sport audiences. So we wanted to look into it a bit further. And what we found was that there's quite a clear scheduling impact here. So 2015, the majority of the Women's Ashes took place during the same time or within the same time frame as the men's 5-test Ashes series. Whereas in 2019, the Women's Ashes took place in July, with the Men's Ashes then taking place starting the day after in August. So there was no overlap there. And when we had a look at trying to quantify that on an audience level, we actually noticed that more viewers that watched the Ashes then went on to watch, more viewers that watched the Men's Ashes then went on to watch the Women's Ashes in 2015 than what we saw in 2019. And we think that's a clear sign that that kind of overlap and taking place at the same time is clearly having an impact on those men's cricket viewers transferring over to watch some women's cricket during that same time as well. And that's very much good news for the 2023 edition that starts this week, given that the entirety of the 2023 Women's Ashes is going to take place within the same time frame of the Men's Ashes, which of course started last week. Not only that, but the ECB launched their marketing campaign for the Ashes, where both the men's and the women's were co-marketed alongside each other. So players and the matches kind of very much advertised side by side. So both the scheduling impact and that kind of marketing campaign, we think, could have a really positive impact on the audiences that we're going to see for the 2023 edition that, as you say, starts this week. So wrapping all of that up with some key takeaways. Firstly, on a total or an overall women's sport viewership level, January to May this year was the most watched we've ever seen for women's sport, with 22.0 million viewers watching 3 minutes or more. And 57% of those viewers watched a property on at least 2 occasions, so 2 or more occasions, and that figure's up 53% from what we saw in 2022. On the property specific level, 1.4 million more people watched 3 minutes or more of live BWSL content this season compared to the previous season in 21-22. And also that particular audience brought a younger audience, or the BWSL audience brought a younger audience to what's typically seen on both BBC and Sky channels. In rugby union, the TikTok Women's Six Nations was the most watched on record, with 6.1 million viewers reached across all games. And finally, on cricket, the ICC Women's T20 World Cup was the most watched version ever, with 7.1 million viewing hours. And we're looking forward to hopefully a similar feat and similar high audiences for the Women's Ashes, as I say, starting this week. That's it from us. Thanks a lot for listening. I'm going to hand back to Tammy now.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Thanks, Emma and Shalina. It's been a really great story around visibility, and thank you as well for all your questions that are coming in. You're obviously a really engaged and passionate bunch, so that's absolutely brilliant. I'd now like to pass to Claire Kelly from Gemba, who will talk about the content we're providing and how audiences are being served. And this research has been commissioned by the Women's Sport Trust as part of our partnership with the RNA. Claire, over to you.
Thanks very much, Tammy. Hi, everyone. I'm really excited to share the findings of our research with you today. So in terms of women's sport, we're going to be focusing on 3 key areas: growing the fan base, deepening their engagement, and unlocking spending power, with the bulk of the presentation focused in that middle section of deepening their engagement. Just a bit of context, we conducted our research at the beginning of April. So in terms of the women's sport that our respondents would have been exposed to in the run-up to the research, there have been a lot of high-profile football, so the Barclays Women's Super League title run-in, FA Cup later rounds, UEFA Champions League later rounds. From a cricket perspective, the ICC Women's T20 World Cup and the Women's Premier League, and then from a rugby perspective, the TikTok Women's Six Nations. So some fantastic tournaments and events in the run-up to our respondents taking this survey. But it is worth bearing in mind that it was a quieter period for tennis and golf. So starting with some headlines around growing the fan base. So the key insight is that there are 6 million committed fans of women's sport in the UK, and I'll come on to explain that definition to you shortly. In terms of growing that 6 million, one of the key levers that we've identified is converting committed men's sport fans to committed women's sport fans. So in terms of how we've categorized these fan groups, we've done it on 2 dimensions. We've asked about their passion for individual women's sports on a scale of 1 to 5. And we've also asked respondents about the amount of live content for women's sport that they're consuming every week. And so to make it to that threshold of a committed women's sports fan, you have to say that you are 5 out of 5 in terms of your passion for a women's sport. And you also have to be watching an hour of live content a week. To qualify as a casual fan, you could say you're a 5 out of 5 in terms of passion, but be consuming less than an hour a week, or say that you are a 4 and also consuming an hour or more. So that combination of passion and live content is really important in how we've classified these fans. Then, as you can see, we drop down the funnel through occasionals and then non-fans. And the bulk of this presentation will be focused on committed and casual fans. So just looking at those fan base sizes in a bit more detail, you can see on the left-hand side, you've got the women's sports fan base. So you've got 6 million women's sport committed fans compared to 16 million men's sports fans. So almost 3 times as many committed men's sports fans as women's. And if you think about this as a marketing funnel, what you see is that at the bottom of that funnel, there are many more non-fans of women's sport than there are men's sports. So 10 million versus 4 million. And then moving up that engagement funnel, there are more occasional women's sports fans than there are men's occasional fans. So 16 million versus 11 million. But then when you get to casual fans, that warmer, more engaged group, it flips. So there are more men's casual fans than there are women's, 17 versus 16. And I've already talked about that quite significant difference between committed fans. So there's a real opportunity there to drive that number of women's committed sports fans up to get closer to that men's fan base. So how could we do this? So starting on the right-hand side of this chart, you'll see that this is the committed women's sports fan universe. So that group of 6 million fans I just touched on the previous slide. And 97% of that group are passionate about both men's and women's sport. So there's a real crossover in the category there in terms of interest and passion, with only 3% passionate about women's sport only. Then if you look on the left-hand side, which is the committed men's sport fan universe, so that's 16 million fan base, 58% are passionate about both men's and women's sport, but 42% are passionate about men's sport only. So there's real headroom and opportunity there to convert some of that 42% from being men's sport fans only into women's sports fans. And if we can do that, we could really drive up that 6 million number. So then looking at how we would then deepen fan engagement once we've acquired those fans. So the headline insight here is that women's sports fans are not yet as dialed in to live content as men's sports fans. They are engaged, but we don't see as deep an engagement as we do in the men's sports fan base. Now, some of that will be due to with supply, but there is also a desire for more innovation, and I'll come on to touch on various aspects of this through the rest of the presentation. So just starting with the amount of live and non-live content that these different fan bases are consuming per week. If you look on the left-hand side, the first 2 columns look at committed fans of men's sport and committed fans of women's sport. The far left shows at the top of the chart, at the top of the bar, that committed fans of men's sport consume over 8 hours of live and non-live content a week, whereas committed fans of women's sport, that second bar in, consume 6 hours. So there's a real shelf there. There's 2 hours difference in terms of the amount of content that's being consumed per week by those different fan bases. And if you look at the dark green, that looks at the proportion of that 8 and 6 hours that's covered by live content. And again, there's a shelf there. So committed men's fans are consuming 5.5 hours on average, whereas committed women's fans are at 3.9. So opportunity to grow that amount of live content, obviously recognizing that supply is part of this, but it was also, as I'll come on to show in the next slide, an interest factor playing out here. You'll also see from a casual fan perspective, the far 2 left-hand sides, two columns on the left-hand side, there's again a little shelf there between casual fan engagement across the 2 different categories. So thinking about live action and highlights in particular, just to give you some context, we asked our fan bases to think about a range of types of content that they are most interested in sport. And by far and away, live action and highlights were the standout 2 areas of interest, as you can expect for the different fan bases. But when we zoom in and look at the differences between committed fans of men's sport and committed fans of women's sport, again, you see that real shelf in terms of engagement. So while 67% of committed fans of men's sport are really interested in live action, only 52% of committed women's sport fans are. And that is something really interesting to think about potential growth and how we drive that interest in really dialing in and making sure you're tuning into the live action and not just reading about it post event or just watching the highlights. We know that getting people hooked on live action is really key to increasing broader engagement and enthusiasm within a sport. And again, you see that same shelf as you look at casual fans of men's sport and women's sport, so the 29% versus the 19%. But what's interesting is that in terms of highlights, it's much more level. So there doesn't seem to be as much of an obvious kind of gap there. So thinking about what women's sports fans want from the broadcast coverage, what's really interesting, if you look at the bottom bar here, is a significant proportion of committed women's sports fans are looking to see greater innovation in the broadcast coverage, indicating that this might be a driver to hook attention and drive further engagement in the live action. Now, there's plenty more to do to understand what they actually mean by that statement. So to dig into more about what that innovation looks like. But as a teaser, one of the questions we asked was around what they would like to see from the live sports broadcasts. And 51% of committed women's sports fans said that they would like to be able to hear from their favourite streamers during live sports broadcasts, which is a little bit higher than we saw for committed men's sports fans. So an interesting area to investigate there. And then I found this absolutely fascinating, this insight. So this is looking at attitudes towards attitudes towards content and what would drive that interest. What we see here is that rivalries and best versus best are really important for both men's and women's sports fans, but much more so for men's committed sports fans than women's. So on the left-hand side, you see 73% of committed men's sports fans tend to consume more women's sports content in weeks when the best players or teams compete, whereas only 60% of women's sports fans say the same. And on the right-hand side, you see 68% of committed men's sports fans are more likely to watch a women's live game or a live game if they're interested in rivalries that have been built up between teams and players before a match, whereas only 54% of women's sports fans feel the same about women's sports matches. So it's not because those rivalries don't necessarily exist or that the best versus best isn't playing out. It's perhaps that there could be more to be done around the narratives of driving that engagement for those fan bases. So how can we talk more about those rivalries? How can we get that fan base excited about when those best versus best matches happen so that they are tuning in and getting excited about that live action? And that actually links to notification usage, which was a really interesting part of the research that we drilled into. So what we're looking at here is the amount of fans that have notifications turned on, and then their feelings around the availability of notifications. So you'll see on the right-hand side that 64% of committed women's sports fans currently use notifications, whereas that compares to 75% of men's sports fans. And looking at the layer below, you see that 52%, so just over half, only just over half feel that there are enough notifications available to them within the women's sports fan base. So 48% of people are saying that there aren't enough notifications that suit them. Compared that to 69% of men's sports fans. So not only are the women's sports fan base not using notifications as much, but they also feel that there just aren't as many available to them as the men's sports fan base. And digging into why these fan bases are using notifications at the moment, again, told quite an interesting story. And it connects back to that idea of women's sports fans not necessarily being as dialed in yet to the sports content. So on the left-hand side, you see that men's sports fans, reasons for using notifications focus primarily around score updates, breaking news, and starting lineups, with score updates being the most important driver of usage, with 53% of committed men's sports fans having those set up. Whereas if you look over to the right-hand side, you see that that's much lower across the board for the different areas, but score updates in particular is significantly different to men's sports fans. So only 34% of committed women's sports fans have score updates set up on their phones or devices, and only 18% have starting lineups set up. So again, that interest around the beginning of a match or throughout the match, what the score is, how their team is getting on, how that player is getting on, isn't necessarily resonating or cutting through as much with that women's sports fan base as it could. So now thinking about non-live content, what we see here is that non-live content can play a key role in deepening engagement as well, particularly around putting a spotlight on player skills, stories, and rivalries. To start off with, we looked at the amount of non-live sports content available and the accessibility of that non-live sports content. And again, you see a shelf here. So you see that 58% of committed women's sports fans wish that there was more content available, non-live content available. And you compare that to just 44% of committed men's sports fans' feelings about men's sport content. And then you've got 47% of committed women's sports fans saying it's difficult to find that non-live sports content. So similar trend to the notifications. They wish that there was more, and they also find accessibility currently a bit of an issue. And there's a significant difference there between the 47% for women's sports fans versus the 19% for committed men's sports fans. So just digging in a little bit into the type of content that these fan bases are most interested in. We've highlighted in dark green the types of content that's focused in on players specifically versus teams or general score updates. And you see that the committed women's fan base have player skills as second as the area of interest or the area that interests the most. And then player personalities and stories is fourth. And in the men's side, that player personalities and stories doesn't come through as strongly, and player skills is fourth. So whilst they're both very interested in best shots, goals, highlights packages, we do see a subtle difference there in the fan base areas of interest. And it suggests that dialing into the players themselves is as important as the teams and the general score that's happening in matches and performances. But then looking at the ease of access of those specific types of content, what you see on the right-hand side in those percentages is only 58% of committed women's sports fans say that player skill content is easy to access. Same with player personalities and stories. And only 48% feel that stories on team and player rivalries and controversies is easy to access. So whilst they're saying this content is really interesting to them and would drive their interest, they're finding it difficult to access that. And if you compare that to men's sports fans, what we're looking at here on the right-hand side in the pink and the green boxes is the difference in percentage points between ease of access for the men's sport fan base and the women's sport fan base. And again, zooming in on those player areas, you see significant differences here. So for men's sports fans, we see 61% say it's easy for them to find and access stories on team players, rivalries and controversies, compared to that 48% for women's sports fans. Player skills, it's 70% versus 58%. And then player personalities and stories is actually more level, but both of them are quite low. So there's real headroom for growth here, both in terms of the types of content that we're putting out and the availability and ease of that fan base of accessing that content that they're really interested in finding. And just giving some examples of that incredible player skill that could be tentpoled. I was watching these videos back yesterday, and they're just absolutely fantastic moments of women's sports skill. So whether it be Kelsey Gentle's tackle in the Rugby World Cup nines, Alicia Rosso's back heel in the Women's Euros, or Frida Manum's goal in the Women's Champions League for Arsenal, they're all absolute fantastic moments of player skill. And if we can continue to dial up moments like this and really drive engagement with them, it will be fantastic to encourage people on to then find more and more content, whether it be live or non-live content about the women's game. And not only is it about spotlighting the player skill, but it's actually also about humanizing those players for the committed women's sport fan base. So on the left-hand side, you see both committed fans of men's sport and committed fans of women's sport have sporting skill and entertainment as their key drivers of athlete likability. But in terms of key differences between those two fan bases, women's sports fans really see that these athletes are role models, and they also identify with them. So how we can humanize them and create that narrative around their experiences, around their journey, about what they're doing between matches, between performances, will really help to spotlight that these people can be relatable, that these athletes are relatable, and drive that further engagement. And then it's just worth bearing in mind what non-live and live sports content is up against. So we looked at the barriers to consumption for our different fan bases. And what we found is that work commitments and then watching other forms of entertainment were the top two barriers. So thinking about snackable content that could fit around busy work schedules, whether it be podcasts or highlights, and then also just thinking about that level of entertainment that's required, and that engagement and innovation in the broadcast in order to convert fans away from watching Netflix and other forms of entertainment into women's sport is obviously going to be key to driving up that regular viewership. So finally, just going to dig into how we could start to unlock the spending power of these fan bases. And the key headline here is that committed fans of women's sport should be a key target market for rights holders and brands. And the reason for that is that they tend to have most financial control in the household. So on the right-hand side, you see that 70% of committed women's sports fans are responsible for most financial household decisions, versus 64% of committed men's sports fans. And 100% of committed women's sports fans either have full responsibility or share the financial decision-making. That's 70% plus the 30%. So there is a wallet here to access and activate if engaged in the right way. And it isn't necessarily to do with income and affluence, because on the left-hand side, we see actually it's a relatively similar picture painted across the two different fan bases. There is a little bit higher percentage of committed women's sports fans that sit in that £60,000 to £99,000 income bracket, but it's not a huge significant difference. So it's really thinking about that financial control that separates out those two fan bases and why they're such a great target for brands and rights holders. So thinking about attitudes towards media consumption, on the left-hand side, you see that 82% of committed women's sports fans feel it's really important that women's sport is shown on free-to-air TV as well as dedicated channels. However, interesting insight that I think requires a bit more digging into and understanding is that 61% of that group actually said that they would like to see a dedicated women's only sports channel. So, fantastic to dig into that more to understand the drivers of why they have that interest and appetite and what that could look like. But fascinating insight to understand. And then of that group that would be interested in a dedicated women's sports channel, 40% of that group are saying that they would be willing to pay for it. And they've given an indication that they would be prepared to pay in the range of about £7 for that dedicated channel. Now, I'm sure many of you are aware that when you ask willingness to pay questions, you just have to be a bit careful with the exact amounts that people come out with, and price choice modeling research is perhaps a more sophisticated way of getting to that than just asking the one question that we were able to do in our research so far. So lots more to dig into here, but a really fascinating story playing out there. And what was encouraging is that when we looked at the proportion of that fan base who said that they were willing to pay, they actually 99% of that group are already paying for a sports subscription. So they are already an engaged fan base. They're already a paying fan base. So there is some credibility to those claims there. And in looking at which sports subscriptions they have, 67% have Prime, 53% have Sky Sports, and 41% have BT Sport. So in summary, the three areas we covered: growing the fan base. There's a key lever to pull in terms of converting more committed men's sports fans to the women's sport fan audience. In terms of deepening engagement, there's an opportunity across live content and non-live content through innovation and a focus on player skills, rivalries, and stories. And then in terms of unlocking the spending power, there's a real opportunity to unlock the wallets of this group who have financial control of their household, and potential to explore the opportunity, or at least understand more the opportunity for a dedicated women's sports channel. Thank you.
Fantastic, thank you, Claire. What a absolutely brilliant, very rich presentation. I'd like to now welcome Chris Hurst to join our panel. He's a trustee of the Women's Sport Trust and leads a lot of our research. And I suppose the first question to you, Chris, is from hearing both of these research, what's your main takeaway?
Thanks, Tammy. I mean, I think there's loads of takeaways from the research, but I think in summary, it just highlights what an exciting position women's sport is in and the trajectory for growth as well. Like when you combine a variety of different factors, so record broadcast visibility, the fact you've got committed audiences who want to be served more content, you've got a large audience who love sport but perhaps haven't yet become fans of women's sport yet, who have the potential to be converted, and then also kind of the last point in the presentation, that this audience is really commercially valuable. Like, bring those four factors together, think about all of the exciting events that we have in the summer and now supported by growing kind of domestic leagues and competitions, be that the WSL, the 100, Premier 15s. I don't think women's sport in the UK has ever been in a more exciting position.
There was a question right at the start around the zone moving behind the paywall. What are your thoughts on that?
I think the challenge in where women's sport at the moment is getting that balance between visibility and commercial viability right, and it is a balancing act, as we've seen through Em and Shalina's presentation. Clearly, free-to-air is very powerful in bringing a large audience to women's sport, and in the case of the Women's Champions League, kind of YouTube playing that role. But also, as Claire showed through her presentation, there are a growing number of committed women's sports fans who are declaring an interest in paying a subscription for women's sport. And so I think it's going to be fascinating to see how successful DAZN are. The industry will learn from broadcasters being brave with its innovation. My understanding is not all games will be behind a paywall. There'll still be some matches available on free to air. But I think the challenge for the women's sports industry in the 2020s is getting that balance between the journey from visibility to commercial viability right. And women's football is probably in the best place ahead of other sports to continue on that journey. So yeah, it's going to be fascinating to see how successful they are.
Yeah, Claire, can I come to you? There was a question around peaks and troughs in women's sport. How can we drive engagement beyond those peaks and troughs? Any thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think that's where the player narratives around their rivalries, their stories of how they became professional athletes is really important. So in between the live action, how can you still connect with that fan base to help them understand these players as humans, these athletes as humans, and also to be building up towards the next matches, the next performances. So thinking about those rivalries and talking about them in depth, thinking about when the best versus best action is happening. I think it's all about momentum here in between events and not just focusing in on those tentpole events just before and after them. So how you can create a narrative throughout the season, throughout the year, I think is really important. And that's where the players themselves on social and through their own content, also through other digital platforms can really be highlighted.
Emma and Shalina, just moving to you guys, there was someone commented about how far ahead in some regards the UK is as far as women's sport and broadcast and things. And what could other countries and markets learn from the UK? Do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, sure. So I think Chris has already touched on that notion of kind of visibility over or versus commercial viability. So I think some of the really successful broadcast models we've seen recently that we've looked a lot into have been the likes of the Women's 100, the Barclays Women's Super League, where they've got that exposure on free to air and they're getting the numbers or the high audience reach on the likes of BBC, but then they've got the kind of consistent coverage on Sky as well. And we've seen that, that brings in the high audiences and then the kind of slightly more engaged kind of avid fans on Sky. And I think that's something that certainly has not been seen that much so far in other markets. So that kind of combination, especially when a tournament like the 100 that was obviously still in a pretty relative stage of infancy in terms of how long it's been going, to have that combination, to be able to kind of reach people on that free to air level, I think is really, really key. And when you're kind of bringing in a new property or trying to grow the game or grow women's sport in a I suppose a slightly less developed country in terms of women's sport.
You're breaking up a little bit. It's one of those awful sort of Wi-Fi moments again. Chris, if I could come to you, there's a question around the TikTok Women's Six Nations, and how can, given the men's only viewers, how can things be promoted to the men's only viewers during the men's tournament? Any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I mean, I think there were some really good examples during the Men's Six Nations of BBC in particular using its coverage not just in rugby union, but also in other high-profile sporting moments to cross-promote the Women's Six Nations. So I seem to recall, for example, in the Men's FA Cup semi-final at half-time, them playing A Trail for the Women's Six Nations, so using those big broadcasting moments to help audiences discover content is really important. But it's not just about converting kind of men's sports fans to the Women's Six Nations. I also think there's a great opportunity to build a unique audience who initially might just love women's sport, and through some of the work that the Women's Sports Trust is doing with the RFU and O2, we've certainly found that the success of women's rugby union in attracting a young, diverse audience, and so thinking about how you support the growth of those kind of communities rather than just trying to convert kind of men's sports fans is a balance to get right.
Thinking about that, there was a question to do with netball. Claire, I'm going to come to you. A point around a lot of this seems to be about leveraging existing audiences and men's sport and so forth, and therefore how can we grow audiences for traditional women's sports such as netball. My gut says still those same rivalries and all those sorts of things is the important thing. Having done the research, what would you say?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think what's really interesting is that because the men's sport fan universe are just further up that engagement journey, that history with men's sport, perhaps those rivalries are already very well understood and they're almost a bit more of a given. So if it's Man United versus Man City, that's very, very well established and understood, or particular players on the golf course. So whether it be Brooks versus Bryson back in the day a couple of years ago. So I think what you've got to think about with women's sports fans is that they're not yet as far up that engagement journey. So really dialing in those headline rivalries, those headline moments is going to drive quite a significant level of interest, and they just can't be assumed to be a kind of a given as they would be in men's sport. So I think it's still talking about the same things, but just spotlighting them even more so in a more pronounced way than perhaps would be done so on the men's sports side. And I think for netball, I think it's thinking about the skill of those players and how you can translate that to other sports potentially, which have different engagement at the moment, and thinking about what is it about a professional netballer that makes them so unique and stands them out, because that will not only humanize them, but it will also wow with that level of skill that they have as individuals.
Well, I'm just aware that we've suddenly hit 10 o'clock. I'm going to steal a couple more minutes from you and just ask each of you on the panel here, I suppose, a key takeaway or one thing that has interested you, or just something that sticks in your mind from what we're putting out today. Emma and Shalina, you're nodding, so I'm going to come straight to you first.
Yeah, I can start. I think something that I found really interesting in Claire's research was about, I guess, the lack of access of women's sport in terms of timing. So things like there was that slide around work commitments and things on Netflix, or not being able to see it. And I think that's kind of a key one. It feels like Netflix has really taken a step into sport, particularly sport documentaries. So it feels like that's a big area. So I guess with women's sport fans being interested in players and personalities, but then having that access. So I think like Game On, which is obviously coming to Netflix next week, or breakpoint that has some female players. I think that's a really interesting part. And I think it'll be interesting to see how that kind of becomes a larger part of the industry and women's sport viewership going forward.
Claire, since oh, sorry, Emma, go for it.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I was actually going to reference something in Claire's presentation as well. I think the thing that really stuck out for me was that the amount of live content that men's and women's committed fans are actually watching. So that 2-hour gap is quite a sizable gap and really just shows the opportunity there. But I think the other thing that I took from it was, looking ahead to the Women's World Cup, where we know the live content will be less important than other tournaments just because of that time zone difference. And obviously one element of that kind of live content disparity is in the access, but it's also clearly the research Claire showed was in there's a bigger interest or a deeper interest in the kind of shoulder content and the players' stories and personality side of things on the women's sports side of things. So it's more of what I'm looking forward to, but I'm looking forward to how that really comes to light, probably more so than we've ever seen for the Women's World Cup, just given that time difference. So yeah, I think that's something that really stood out for me and made me even more excited for the Women's World Cup this summer.
Brilliant, that's fantastic points there as well. Claire, given Emma and Shalina have just commented on your research, anything you want to comment on theirs?
Yeah, I mean, similar to Emma's point, but the other way, really. I was really excited to see the viewership numbers and the engagement with Barclays WSL, with the TikTok Six Nations and the ICC World Cup, because it's showing that engagement is really growing, and particularly with the TikTok Women's Six Nations. I thought the story there was absolutely fantastic. So the same amount of published hours, but viewership numbers increasing. And not only that, seeing that in those regional splits that there was starting to be those crossovers between people that are watching the men's Six Nations and the women's Six Nations was really encouraging, and obviously ties in with that thread that we had in our research as well. So feels like a really positive story, and can't wait to see what happens with the Women's Ashes coming up and the Women's World Cup and the AIG Women's Open. Obviously, fantastic platforms for further growth.
Brilliant. And Chris?
I think it's just exciting that there is an audience who want to be better served. And so how can rights holders do that, but also potentially what role can brands play in connecting with these audiences and providing better activations for those fans who currently feel underserved. And I suppose it's a natural moment to talk about the fact in a couple of weeks' time we've got more Women's Sports Trust research coming out just on those opportunities for brands to connect with women's sports fans. And so, yeah, I think taking this research that we've released today with the research that's coming out in the next couple of weeks, it's just a really, really exciting opportunity to continue the unstoppable rise of women's sport.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. And the webinar that Chris just mentioned, I've just put the link into the chat. Do register for that. It's again, really fascinating stuff. We're already on overtime, so unfortunately that's all we've got time for this morning. Please encourage your colleagues to head over to the Women's Sport Trust website to download a copy of the reports. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you hugely to Chris, to Emma, Shalina and Claire for your contributions. Have a great day, everybody.